is Galagar, and today we're going to continue the discussion about Jewish literature, focusing on the story of Ruth and Genesis, the creation. First, why does the story of Ruth and Genesis is part of a Jewish literature? First, because it is part of the Hebrew Bible. It expresses Jewish religious beliefs, cultural values that originate from ancient Israelite tradition and still remain a central part of Jewish practice and interpretation. Now let's delve into the story of Ruth. The story of Ruth can be found in the book of Ruth in the Bible. The story of Ruth is a Hebrew historical short story because it contains only 4 chapters but rich in detail, focusing on the personal lives of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. Unlike books of law or prophecy, it tells a narrative set in a specific historical context. It is during the time of the Judges. The time of Judges was marked by a continuous cycle of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance. So others would also consider it as a novelle. So what do you mean by novelle? Novelle is a plural form of an Italian word novella, referring to a short prose narrative. The book of Ruth can be found in the Old Testament. Now for the summary. The story of Ruth, a Moabite woman, is found in the book of Ruth, a part of a Hebrew Bible and a Jewish tradition, detailing her deep loyalty to her mother-in-law, Naomi, by accompanying her to Bethlehem and adopting her people and God. There, Ruth meets and marries Boaz, a wealthy relative, becoming the great-grandmother of King David and a significant figure as a Jew by choice. And now let's proceed to the plot. The story started when Naomi, Elimelech, their son Mahlon and Chilion, sought refuge in the land of Moab, a neighboring land of Israel, because there was scarcity of food in Bethlehem. They lived there for 10 years, but sadly Elimelech died. Not long after, Mahlon and Chilion married a Moabite woman. Mahlon married Ruth and Chilion married Orpah. But again sadly, Mahlon and Chilion both died, leaving Ruth, Orpah, and Naomi widowed. When Naomi learned that the famine had ended in Bethlehem, she decided to go back. Along the way, she convinced her 2 daughters-in-law to go back to their people. Orpah chooses to go back, but Ruth decided to stay. When they reach Bethlehem, Ruth has to find a way to support herself and Naomi. That's why she decided to glean in the field, and that's where she meets Boaz. Boaz become the redeemer of the land of Naomi's relatives and eventually marries Ruth, where they had a son or child named Obed, the ancestor of King David. So now let's proceed to the characters and their characterization. First, we have Ruth. She is the central figure, a symbol of loyalty, steadfastness, and selfless devotion. She demonstrates exceptional loyalty to Naomi, vowing to stay with her and adopt her people and God. Her commitment is profound, example of covenant fidelity and acceptance of new faith and culture, a significant act for a foreign woman of her time. Second is Naomi. Initially, Naomi is a figure of deep loss and bitterness, feeling empty and forsaken after the deaths of her husband and 2 sons in a foreign land. However, she transforms as her loyalty to Naomi becomes a beacon, bringing joy and new life back to her in Bethlehem. Third, we have Boaz. Boaz is an honorable and compassionate Israelite man who embodies leadership and moral integrity. Boaz is the second husband of Ruth. He is shown to be a caring and protective figure, demonstrating kindness to Ruth by leaving extra grain to her to glean and eventually acting as her kinsman redeemer. He also displays a strong sense of responsibility and fairness, ensuring that the proper and legal and familial relations or traditions are followed. Then we have other characters. First is Orpah. The other Moabite daughter-in-law serves as a casting foil to Ruth because she chooses to return to her own people, a pagan culture, representing a different path from the deep commitment that Ruth shows. Then we have Mahlon and Chilion. So these two characters are described as one-dimensional, flat figure in the narrative, functioning primarily as sons of Naomi and Elimelech, whose early deaths set the stage for the story's main events. Their significance lies in their connection to the woman rather than their own individual development. And lastly, we have Elimelech. Elimelech is the husband of Naomi and the father of Mahlon and Chilion, but sadly also died. Now let's proceed to the settings in the story of Ruth. First is we have Moab. It is where the story begins, a neighboring land east of Israel, where Elimelech, Naomi, and their sons seek refuge from famine in Bethlehem. So this foreign land is marked by tragedy because it is where Elimelech dies, and later on both of Naomi's son dies, leaving her and her daughter-in-law widowed. The Moab represents exile, loss, and uncertainty in the narrative. The next is we have Bethlehem. Bethlehem in Judah. After hearing that the famine has ended, Naomi returns to her homeland and Ruth chooses to accompany her. Bethlehem, also the house of bread, becomes the central setting where Ruth gleans in the fields, meets Boaz, and eventually marries him. So this setting represents restoration, providence, and new beginnings. Now we have here the conflict. First we have man versus society, poverty and social status. Ruth and Naomi are left destitute and vulnerable after the death of their husbands. Ruth's status as a Moabite woman in Judea would have been a significant social disadvantage, as there was animosity between the two nations at that time. Establishing a future. Ruth's primary goal is to find a way to support herself and Naomi in a society where a foreign widow have limited options. Then second, we have man versus self. Loyalty and sacrifice. Ruth's decision to stay with Naomi, declaring, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." So it is a profound act of selfless commitment that requires her to abandon her own people and culture. In man versus self, we also have faith and perseverance. So despite the overwhelming hardships, Ruth's decision demonstrates strong faith and perseverance in pursuing hopeful future with Naomi and adapting to Naomi's God. The point of view of the story is omniscient third-person point of view because it narrates the story of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. So now let's move on to the literary devices in the story of Ruth. First, we have metaphor. Example is spreading the cloak or wings. So when Ruth asked Boaz to spread your cloak over your servant, for you are a redeemer, The Hebrew word for cloak can also mean wings. So this metaphor suggests both marital protection and divine refuge. This shows how Boaz's protection mirrors God's care. Second is we have symbolism. Bethlehem, the house of bread, like what I've said earlier. The famine at the start contrasts with the abundance later, symbolizing the movement from emptiness to fullness. Also, we have the harvest. The barley and the wheat harvest symbolizes new beginnings, provision, and fertility, aligning with Ruth's marriage and the birth of Obed, which will become later on the ancestor of King David. Then we have here third, the irony. It is when Naomi returns to Bethlehem and she refuses to call herself Naomi. Instead, she told the people to call her Mara, which means bitter, claiming that God has dealt harshly with her. Yet, by the end, she holds Obed, her grandson, showing how bitterness turns into blessings. This irony highlights God's providence working behind ordinary events. And here we also have the recurring themes in the story of Ruth. First is the loyalty and devotion. Ruth's famous pledge to Naomi, declaring, "Where you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." This devotion extends beyond obligation because Ruth freely chooses loyalty, following her mother-in-law in Bethlehem, modeling selfless kindness. The next we have providence and redemption. Though God never speaks directly, His guidance is seen as coincidence, such as Ruth happening to glean in Boaz's field. Right? So when Ruth was gleaning in Boaz's field, he meets Boaz. If that didn't happen, if Ruth didn't glean in the field of Boaz, he wouldn't be able to marry Boaz, and he wouldn't be able to be the ancestor of King David. So the resolution comes through Boaz as kinsman redeemer, restoring Naomi's family line and pointing toward divine redemption of Israel. Then third theme we have from emptiness to fullness. Naomi's lament, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." But by the end, Naomi holds Obed, symbolizing her fullness restored. So this theme parallels Israel's cycle of famine to restoration. Fourth, we have the inclusion of outsider. Diba? Because Ruth, a Moabite woman and a foreigner, becomes fully accepted into Israel and even became the ancestor of King David. So this reflects the universalism in Jewish literature. Outsiders who embrace Israel's God can share in covenant blessings. Then lastly, we have faithfulness leads to blessing. Ruth's loyalty and Boaz's righteousness bring about blessing not just for them, but for the whole community. So are we clear in the story of Ruth? Now let's proceed to Genesis, the creation. The word Genesis comes from Greek word and it means origin or beginning. The first chapter of Genesis is very formal, tales structured clearly, and consistent around 7 days. It is a way of going about its work within that structure, It is very formal, and so it is rather repetitive literary style. Because when God says something is to happen, and it happened, like let be light, and light was. There are also, of course, specific ways of dealing with various happening on the given day. So the book of Genesis approximates the epic genre. It is very close to epic. But what do you mean by epic? Epic refers to an extended poem that recounts the great achievement of a hero in an elevated style. So why does the Genesis, the creation, is or approximate to epic? It is because first, grand subject matter. So like epic, Genesis deals with origins and the world, humanity, and divine order. Second is majestic language and structure. Genesis has a rhythmic, repetitive structure, like God and said, and it was so, and God saw that it was good. So it gives a poetic, elevated style typical of epic literature. Third is the divine character and cosmic events. In epics, God or divine beings often shape the world. In Genesis, God is the central actor, creating by command, showing supreme power and authority. That's why it approximates the epic genre. Now let's move on to the summary. God's creation of the universe and humanity over 6 days, culminating in the 7th day of rest, beginning with darkness and an empty earth. God creates light on the first day, the sky and separating waters on the second day, dry land and plants on the third day, the sun, moon, and stars on the fourth, sea creatures and birds on the 5th day, and finally land, animals, and humans on the 6th day. Then God declares His creation very good, blesses humanity to be fruitful and rule over the earth, and then rest on the 7th day, making it holy. Now let's have a day-by-day breakdown of the story. So on the first day, God creates light and separates it from darkness, naming them day and night. On the second day, God forms the sky or expanse to separate the waters above from the waters below. Then third day, God gathers the water to form seas and causes dry land to appear, which He then commands to produce vegetation and trees. On the fourth day, God creates the sun, moon, and stars in the sky to mark days and seasons. On the 5th day, God populates the waters with fish and other sea life, and fills the skies with birds. On the 6th day, God creates all kinds of land animals and finally humanity in His own image, breathing life into man and forming woman from a rib. Now on the 7th day of rest, after completing all His work, God observes that it is very good. He blesses the humans, giving them dominion over the earth and instructing them to be fruitful and multiply. On the 7th day, God rests from His work, blessing and sanctifying it. Now let's have the key characters in the creation. Of course, first is God. He is the powerful creator of the heavens and earth and humanity. So by just words, He created the world. Then second, we have Adam, the first man created by God, given dominion over the earth and tasked with responsibilities in the Garden of Eden. Of course, we have Eve, the first woman created by God from Adam's side, and the mother of the human race. So now, let's move on to the literary device used in Genesis to creation. First, we have repetition. The phrase, "and God said, and it was so, and God saw that it was good." It is repeated throughout, creating rhythm and emphasizing God's authority and goodness of creation. We also have the refrain, and there was evening and there was morning, the day. It structures the narrative. Then second is parallelism. The sentences often mirrors one another in structure. Like the sentence, God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. So parallelism is a rhetorical device that involves using similar grammatical structures, words or phrases to create balance, rhythm, and emphasis in writing. So in this sentence, God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created. It is somewhat like closely similar, like the phrase is closely similarly to the context. Parallelism is a hallmark of Hebrew poetry, and it gives it balance and emphasis. Third, we have imagery. So the vivid natural imagery of light or darkness, water, dome of sky, vegetation, the sun, moon, stars, and animals. It appeals to the senses of the readers and help them imagine the unfolding creation of God. Fourth, we have symbolism. The light versus darkness. It symbolizes order over chaos and good over nothingness, right? Then the dome of sky and separation of water. It symbolizes boundaries and structure in creation. We have also the number 7. Number 7 symbolizes completeness and perfection. Another is anaphora. Anaphora is something like similar to repetition, but anaphora focuses on the repetition at the beginning of the phrases. So the repeated opening, "Then God said," this highlights the creative power of divine speech. Now let's move on to the themes of the Genesis creation. So first, of course, creation and order. The story emphasizes that the universe was created with intention and structure. God brings order out of chaos, like formless void to light, land, seas, vegetation, animals, and humans. Then second, we have the power of divine word. Because God creates the world through speech, like "and God said, and it was so." So this shows the authority of divine command and the creative power of language itself. Third is separation and boundaries. So there were light or darkness, waters above or below, then land and sea, night and day. So it establishes boundaries that define the natural order. So this reflects the theme of bringing cosmos or order out of chaos. And that's it for my report. I hope you listened because I have here a question. So, how do the narratives of Ruth and Genesis as part of the Hebrew Bible reflects the religious beliefs, cultural values, and literary traditions of ancient Israel? And in what ways do these stories continue to shape Jewish identity and interpretation today? Comment down your answer below. That's it. Thank you everyone for listening and have a good day.